My husband believed his mother over the woman he married and threw me out into a blinding winter storm. "Get out, you are nothing but a burden," he screamed over the howling wind. 3 hours later, the police called him. He walked into my hospital trauma room, stared at the medical monitors, and completely froze. "This cannot be true. What have I done?" he whispered, dropping to his knees. He thought he had successfully discarded a cheating wife. But what he actually threw away that night would cost him his lucrative finance career, his freedom, and his entire toxic family. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old, and I work as an independent forensic accountant. I spent 5 years trying to build a peaceful life with a man who refused to cut the cord with his manipulative mother. Before I dive into the blizzard that changed my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been falsely accused by the people who were supposed to protect you, and you had to let the cold, hard truth do the fighting for you. The screech of a nylon zipper cut violently through the heavy silence of the living room. Before I could even process what was happening, David grabbed my heavy winter suitcase by the handle and dragged it toward the heavy oak front door of our Aspen cabin. Outside, a historic blizzard was tearing through the Colorado mountains. The local news had already issued emergency alerts. It was -10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind was howling so loudly it rattled the thick window panes. David did not care. He threw the deadbolt open, letting a vicious blast of freezing wind and snow explode into the entryway. My lungs seized from the sudden drop in temperature. He lifted my heavy suitcase and hurled it out onto the snow-covered porch. It landed with a dull thud, immediately disappearing under a fresh layer of white powder. "Get out of my house," David roared. His face twisted in a kind of rage I had never seen before. His voice echoed over the roaring storm. "You are nothing but a liar and a thief. I want you out of my sight right now." I stood there in my thin cashmere sweater and leggings, completely barefoot on the hardwood floor. The icy wind ripped through my clothes, chilling my skin instantly. I reached out to grab the doorframe to steady myself. "David, what are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking from both the freezing air and the sheer shock of his aggression. "You cannot throw me out into this. The roads are closed. It is a state of emergency out there. Do not play the victim with me, Natalie," he spat, stepping closer and backing me toward the open doorway. "My mother showed me the bank statements. She showed me the wire transfers. I know exactly what you did with the $250,000 that went missing from her retirement savings account." The sheer absurdity of the accusation knocked the breath out of me. Brenda, his mother, had been living well beyond her means for years, funding luxury vacations and expensive country club memberships. But before I could even formulate a defense, David kept yelling. "Did you really think I would not find out about your secret lover?" he shouted, his eyes wide and manic. "You drained my mother's life savings to fund some guy named Dr. Evans. Have you been sleeping with him in this very cabin? Is that why you always wanted to come up here for the weekends?" The freezing air was numbing my fingers and toes. Snow was blowing directly into my face, melting against my warm skin and dripping down my neck. I tried to step back inside to escape the biting cold, but David shoved his hand against my shoulder, physically blocking my re-entry. He did not hit me, but the force of his arm was enough to push me backward onto the icy threshold. "David, please," I begged, wrapping my arms around my shivering torso. "Let me get my coat. Let me get my boots. We can look at the bank statements together. I am a forensic accountant. I can prove to you right now that I did not take a single dime from Brenda. Let me look at the routing numbers. You are going to use your little corporate tricks to lie your way out of this," he sneered, completely dismissing my decade of professional expertise. "My mother warned me about you. She warned me you would try to manipulate the numbers. She hired a private investigator, Natalie. We know about the weekly transfers. We know about Dr. Evans. You are a thief and a cheat, and I am done funding your double life." The wind gusted violently, nearly knocking me off balance. The temperature was dropping by the minute, and I could feel my body starting to violently shiver. The harsh reality of the situation began to set in. He was not just angry, he was intentionally putting my life in danger. "Get out," he screamed one final time. He pushed me fully out onto the snow-covered porch. My bare feet sank deep into the freezing wet snow. The pain was immediate, like 1,000 sharp needles piercing my skin. Before I could even turn around to grab the door handle, the heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. The loud metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly over the storm. I pounded my bare fists against the thick wood. The freezing wood scraped my knuckles, but David did not return. The porch light suddenly shut off, plunging me into complete and total darkness in the middle of a deadly blizzard. Just as the numbness began creeping up my legs, the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sounded again. The porch light flickered back to life, temporarily blinding me against the driving snow. The heavy oak door cracked open, releasing a wave of warm air from the fireplace inside. I lunged forward, thinking David had finally snapped out of his blind rage. But it was not David standing in the doorway. It was his mother, Brenda. She stood there looking like she was dressed for a holiday country club dinner, wearing a pristine white cashmere cardigan that looked ridiculously out of place against the backdrop of the raging winter storm. In her left hand, she casually swirled a generous pour of vintage Merlot in a crystal wineglass. In her right hand, she held a thick stack of printed papers, the corners fluttering violently in the freezing gusts. David stood just over her shoulder, like an obedient guard dog. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and he deliberately kept his gaze fixed on the hardwood floor instead of making eye contact with me. The man I had shared a bed with for 5 years could not even look his freezing wife in the eye while his mother did the talking. "I am not going to let you manipulate my son anymore," Brenda said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet venom that cut through the howling wind. "You can stop playing the shivering victim, Natalie. It will not work this time." "Brenda, please." My teeth were chattering so violently I could barely form the words. "It is -10 degrees out here. Please just let me inside. We can talk about this in the morning. I did not take your money." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, completely unfazed by the fact that I was standing barefoot in a snowdrift. "We are not talking about anything in the morning. 5 years, Natalie. 5 years I have waited for a grandchild. 5 years I have watched you prioritize your little accounting career while my son patiently waited for you to become a real wife. I always knew there was something wrong with you. A woman who refuses to give her husband a family is capable of any kind of deceit." She stepped closer to the threshold, waving the stack of papers in my face. The highlighted bank logos flashed under the porch light. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, did you not? You thought because you audit companies for a living, you could hide your tracks from your own family. But a mother always knows when her son is being used. I hired a private investigator last month. I paid him handsomely to follow the money you thought you were hiding." My mind raced. Hide what money? I managed all our household finances because David was notoriously terrible with budgeting, but every single cent was meticulously accounted for. There were no hidden accounts. "Do not look so confused," Brenda sneered, her eyes lighting up with malicious joy. "The investigator found the wire transfers, weekly payments, thousands of dollars funneled out of David's joint accounts and straight to a man named Dr. Evans. You could not give my son a child, but you certainly had no problem draining his hard-earned money to fund your secret lover." The sheer absurdity of her accusation hit me harder than the freezing wind. I stared at her, my body violently trembling. Dr. Evans was not a secret lover. Dr. Evans was the lead physician at the Aspen Fertility Clinic. I had been wiring him money for the past 6 months to pay for out-of-pocket fertility treatments. We needed those treatments because David had severe fertility issues, and I had quietly taken on the financial burden to spare my husband the unbearable embarrassment of his mother finding out the truth. The money did not even come from Brenda. It came from my own corporate bonuses. "Brenda, listen to me," I pleaded, wrapping my arms tighter around my freezing chest. "Dr. Evans is a fertility specialist. He is a doctor. I have been paying for treatments. I am pregnant, Brenda. I am 8 weeks pregnant with your grandchild. But the howling wind swallowed my words. Brenda did not hear me, or worse, she simply did not care. She looked at me with absolute disgust, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. She had finally won. You are a barren, lying thief, Natalie Brenda said clearly, making sure her words pierced through the storm. And as of tonight, you are no longer our problem. I suggest you start walking. Maybe your Dr. Evans can come warm you up. She stepped back into the warm, brightly lit foyer and took one last sip of her Merlot. She gave David a sharp nod. Without a single word, my husband grabbed the heavy brass handle and pulled the door shut. Wait, David! I screamed, lunging forward. But I was too slow. The solid oak slammed shut with a deafening thud. The metallic slide of the deadbolt locking into place sounded like a gunshot in the freezing night. A second later, the porch light clicked off again. I stood there shivering in the pitch-black cold, the reality of their betrayal sinking into my freezing bones. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint grayish glow of the falling snow reflecting the moonlight hidden behind thick storm clouds. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of my throat. I could not stay on the porch. The wind was whipping around the corners of the cabin, creating a wind tunnel that stripped away whatever body heat I had left. I needed shelter. My eyes darted toward the driveway where the dark silhouette of my SUV sat buried under several inches of fresh snow. If I could just get inside, I could turn on the engine. I could blast the heat. I could survive. I stepped off the wooden porch and plunged into the snowbank. It was up to my knees. Moving forward without boots felt like dragging my bare legs through a field of shattered glass. Every step sent a jolt of agonizing pain all the way up to my hips. My toes went completely numb within seconds, the freezing moisture clinging to my skin and rapidly chilling my blood. I pushed forward, fighting through the heavy drifts, my breath coming out in ragged, foggy gasps. I finally reached the side of my SUV and slammed my freezing hand against the driver's side door. I reached for the keypad on the doorframe, hoping my numb fingers could punch in the 5-digit code to unlock it. But as I leaned my weight against the heavy metal frame, something felt completely wrong. The car was sitting far too low to the ground. The bottom edge of the door was practically resting in the snow. I dropped to my knees, my bare skin sinking into the freezing wet powder. I frantically brushed the snow away from the front tire. It was completely flat. The thick rubber was completely deflated, pooling on the icy asphalt beneath. I ran my frozen fingers along the sidewall of the tire and felt it. A massive, jagged gash. Someone had taken a knife to the heavy-duty rubber. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. I scrambled around to the back tire, digging like a wild animal through the snow. Flat. Another deep, deliberate gash. All 4 tires were completely destroyed. The horrific realization crashed into me harder than the blizzard itself. This was not a spontaneous eviction. This was not a sudden fit of rage fueled by a misunderstanding over bank statements. Brenda had planned this. She had methodically walked out into the freezing cold, taken a blade to my tires, and ensured that I would have absolutely no way to escape. She did not just want me out of the cabin. She wanted me dead. And David had helped her lock the door. My hands shook violently as I dug into the tight pocket of my leggings. By some miracle, my cell phone was still there. I pulled it out, the screen lighting up my terrified face. I stared at the top right corner. No service. Not a single bar. The remote location of the Aspen cabin, combined with the severe winter storm, meant the nearest cell tower was either out of range or completely down. I hit the emergency call button anyway, dialing 911 with fingers that barely responded to my brain. The call immediately failed. The wind howled louder, throwing a sheet of blinding white snow directly into my eyes. My teeth were chattering so violently that I bit my own tongue, the warm, copper taste of blood filling my mouth. I had to get inside the car. Even without the heater, the cabin of the SUV would block the lethal wind chill. I dragged myself back to the front porch, searching frantically in the dark. My hands brushed against the frozen woodpile stacked near the door. I grabbed the heaviest log I could lift, the rough bark tearing at my numb frozen palms. I stumbled back to the SUV, raised the heavy piece of firewood over my head, and swung it as hard as I could against the passenger side window. The log bounced off with a dull thud. The thick tempered glass did not even crack. I screamed in frustration, a raw, primal sound that was instantly swallowed by the roaring storm. I swung again and again, but my body was shutting down. The muscles in my arms felt like they were turning to lead. My core temperature was dropping at a terrifying rate, and my body was pulling all the warm blood away from my limbs to protect my vital organs. The heavy log slipped from my frozen grip and buried itself in the snow. I collapsed against the side of the freezing car, sliding down the metal door until I was huddled on the ground. The agonizing burning pain of the cold was beginning to fade, replaced by a terrifying heavy numbness. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy. My brain was slowing down, the panic giving way to a dangerous, hazy confusion. I curled my knees into my chest, wrapping my arms tightly around my stomach to protect the tiny life growing inside me. The emotional devastation of my husband abandoning me had completely vanished, replaced by the sheer biological terror of freezing to death. The white snow continued to pile up around my shivering body, burying my legs, burying my arms, as the darkness finally began to pull me under. The cold stopped burning and shifted into a heavy, suffocating weight. My vision blurred as the edges of the dark driveway dissolved into a swirling tunnel of white. I could not feel my legs anymore. I could not feel the icy metal of the SUV I was slumped against. The violent shivering that had racked my body for the last 20 minutes suddenly stopped. My professional training from years of auditing healthcare facilities told me exactly what that meant. My core temperature had dropped to a critical level. My body was giving up the fight and shutting down its most basic functions to protect my heart and brain. As my chin dropped to my chest, my mind began to detach from the freezing reality. Instead of the howling wind, my brain started misfiring, projecting vivid memories into the dark. I heard the clinking of fine crystal from our wedding rehearsal dinner 5 years ago. I remembered the exact moment David had handed the microphone to Brenda, watching with a weak smile as she gave a toast entirely about herself, completely ignoring my family. I remembered our first anniversary when David canceled our carefully planned trip to Napa Valley because Brenda claimed she had a sudden migraine and needed him to stay at her house for the entire weekend. The physical ache in my chest from the freezing cold mirrored the hollow ache of a marriage built on a foundation of emotional abandonment. Every single time I had ever needed him to be a husband, he had chosen to be her little boy. He had never protected me. Even now, as I was literally freezing to death on his front lawn, he was probably sitting by the warm stone fireplace, letting his mother pour him another glass of expensive wine, congratulating him for finally getting rid of the problem. The snow kept falling rapidly, piling over my legs and waist. It felt bizarrely like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I tried to force my eyes open, tried to move my numb fingers to dial the phone one more time, but my muscles were completely unresponsive. The dark shape of the cabin loomed in the distance, its warm yellow windows mocking me through the storm. My heartbeat slowed, the thudding in my ears turning into a faint, erratic rhythm. I was going to die here in the driveway. The realization did not bring panic anymore, only a profound, crushing sadness for the innocent child I was carrying. I whispered a silent apology into the dark, letting my heavy eyelids flutter shut for what I thought would be the very last time. Suddenly, a massive vibration shook the ground beneath the snow. It was not the wind. A deep mechanical rumbling cut through the roar of the blizzard. I forced my heavy eyelids open just a fraction. A blinding, pulsating yellow light swept across the snow-covered driveway, illuminating the falling flakes like a frantic strobe light. The deafening sound of a heavy-duty diesel engine roared closer. It was an Aspen County municipal snowplow, its massive metal blades scraping aggressively against the icy main road leading up to the cabin. The massive plow came to an abrupt, screeching halt just feet away from the entrance to our driveway. The yellow strobe lights flashed frantically against the trees. I tried to scream, tried to wave my arm, but my body remained totally paralyzed. I could only watch helplessly as two large figures in neon reflective jackets jumped down from the massive truck cab. They were shouting to each other over the wind, their heavy boots crunching rapidly through the deep snowdrifts. One of the workers shined a high-powered tactical flashlight toward the cabin, the bright white beam sweeping over my ruined SUV, and finally locking onto my half-buried body. "Hey, we got someone down over here," a deep, panicked voice yelled over the storm. The heavy footsteps sprinted toward me. Strong, thick-gloved hands began frantically brushing the heavy snow off my shoulders and face. A warm light blinded me as one of the workers leaned in close, his face obscured by a thick winter ski mask. "Miss, can you hear me?" he shouted, grabbing my frozen shoulder and giving it a gentle shake. "Stay with us. Look at me. Keep your eyes open." He did not wait for a response. He immediately pulled a heavy two-way radio from his chest harness, his voice sharp and urgent. "Dispatch, this is Plow Unit 7. We have a critical medical emergency at the end of Pine Ridge Road. Adult female severe hypothermia, totally unresponsive. We need a Code 3 medical transport right now. I repeat, start a Code 3 bus immediately, we are losing her." The second worker ripped off his own heavy, insulated winter jacket and wrapped it tightly around my freezing torso, trying to trap whatever body heat I had left. "Hang on," the first worker said, his voice tight with absolute fear. "The ambulance is coming. Just hold on." That was the last thing I heard before the blinding yellow lights faded to black and my mind slipped completely away. Aspen General Hospital emergency room was an absolute war zone. The relentless winter storm had transformed the typically quiet mountain town into a chaotic disaster area. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as nurses and orderlies rushed down the hallways, their shoes squeaking against the wet linoleum floors, covered in melted snow and muddy salt. The loud wail of ambulances arriving back-to-back cut through the constant beeping of cardiac monitors. It was a chaotic mix of skiing accidents, frostbite victims, and severe trauma from multi-car pileups on the icy interstate. The heavy automatic double doors of the ambulance bay slid open with a sharp mechanical hum. A brutal gust of freezing wind whipped into the triage area as two paramedics sprinted through, aggressively pushing a stainless steel trauma gurney. "Code 3, incoming," the lead paramedic shouted, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. Adult female, early 30s, found half buried in a snowbank by a county plow crew. Completely unresponsive. Core temperature is critically low at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Pulse is thready, heart rate is dropping fast. Dr. Jamal stepped out of the central charting station. At 32 years old, Jamal was an African-American attending physician known for being the sharpest and most composed doctor on the emergency staff. He thrived in high-pressure situations. He snapped on a pair of blue nitrile exam gloves and pointed firmly toward Trauma Room 1. "Bring her straight in here," Jamal ordered, his deep voice cutting effortlessly through the chaotic noise of the busy ER. "Let us move, team. She is in the absolute danger zone for ventricular fibrillation. I need the full trauma cart and a warming kit right now." The nurses rushed the gurney into the brightly lit trauma bay, clustering around the bed under the glaring surgical lights. They immediately began the process of cutting away the thick, freezing county jacket the snowplow driver had wrapped around the patient. Jamal stepped up to the head of the bed to establish her airway. He looked down at the patient's face to check her pupillary response. Her skin was a terrifying translucent shade of blue. Her lips were cracked and dark purple, and thick ice crystals clung to her eyelashes and hair. Jamal completely froze. His gloved hands hovered motionless over her chest. The clinical professional detachment he relied on every single day instantly shattered into a million pieces. He stared at the woman on the table, his mind violently rejecting what his eyes were clearly seeing. It was Natalie, his sister-in-law, the wife of his brother-in-law David. "Doctor," the charge nurse barked, noticing his sudden and uncharacteristic hesitation. "Her blood pressure is tanking. We are losing her." Jamal blinked hard, snapping violently back to reality. He swallowed the massive choking lump of panic in his throat, and forced his years of medical training to take over. He was not just a family member right now. He was the only barrier standing between Natalie and death. "All right, listen to me," Jamal commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Initiate severe hypothermia protocol immediately. I want warmed intravenous normal saline running wide open on 2 large bore lines. Get a bear hugger forced air warming blanket on her chest right now. We need to raise her core temperature, but we must do it carefully to avoid a lethal afterdrop." The trauma room exploded into a flurry of highly coordinated action. Nurses tore open sterile plastic packaging and carefully inserted IV needles into Natalie's freezing collapsed veins. "Heart rate is dropping to 30 beats per minute," a nurse called out, pointing urgently at the flashing red numbers on the cardiac monitor. "She is severely bradycardic. Do not push any cardiac medications," Jamal instructed, his eyes darting rapidly between Natalie's pale, lifeless face and the digital monitors. "A cold heart is an extremely irritable heart. If we push epinephrine or shock her now, we could send her straight into fatal cardiac arrest. We just need to warm her blood. Get the warm, humidified oxygen mask secured over her face." A clear plastic mask was quickly strapped over her mouth, pumping heated oxygen directly into her freezing lungs. Jamal grabbed a heavy-duty pair of trauma shears and helped the nurses cut away the soaked, freezing remnants of her leggings and sweater. He winced visibly when he saw her bare feet. The tissue on her toes was already turning a dangerous shade of waxy white, the undeniable early signs of severe tissue damage and frostbite. Who leaves a woman out in a deadly blizzard completely barefoot? The horrifying thought raged through Jamal's mind, burning with a sudden, furious heat. He knew David and Natalie's Aspen cabin was miles away from any main road. Someone had deliberately left her outside to die. "Core temperature is slowly rising," the charge nurse announced, her eyes glued to the thermometer. 84 degrees. "Keep the warmed fluids flowing," Jamal said, pressing his stethoscope to her cold chest, listening intently to the slow, struggling rhythm of her heart. "Bring the portable ultrasound machine in here right now. I want to check her abdomen for any internal trauma or fluid pooling." Jamal watched the warming blanket inflate over her shivering body. He knew Natalie was a brilliant, composed professional. Seeing her reduced to this fragile state made his blood boil. He knew exactly what he had to do next. Jamal stepped back from the trauma bed, his chest heaving as he watched the steady, albeit weak rhythm of Natalie's heart on the monitor. The nurses had the situation stabilized for the moment. The bear hugger was doing its job, slowly pushing warm air over her freezing skin. He stripped off his blue nitrile gloves, throwing them violently into the biohazard bin. The adrenaline pumping through his veins was rapidly being replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He knew his brother-in-law. He knew David was a weak, spineless man who constantly hid behind his wealthy, manipulative mother. But Jamal never imagined they were capable of attempted murder. He walked out of Trauma Room 1 and marched straight to the central charting station. He pulled up Natalie's electronic medical record. As an attending physician in the United States, Jamal was a mandated reporter. The law was absolutely clear. When a patient arrives with life-threatening injuries that point to abuse, the hospital does not wait for the victim to wake up and press charges. The hospital acts immediately. Jamal's fingers flew across the keyboard. He documented everything with brutal clinical precision. He noted the severe frostbite on her bare feet, proving she had been forced outside without proper winter clothing. He documented the fresh, dark bruising on her shoulders, perfectly matching the shape of a forceful shove. He noted the timeline, the weather conditions, and the extreme drop in her core temperature. Then, with a heavy, satisfying strike of the Enter key, Jamal flagged her chart with the highest-level emergency code for domestic violence. This single action legally locked down the evidence. Nobody, not even a high-paid lawyer hired by Brenda, could erase this medical record now. Jamal reached across the desk and picked up the direct emergency line to the Aspen Police Department. The dispatcher answered on the first ring. "This is Dr. Jamal at Aspen General Hospital Emergency Department," he said, his voice steady and deadly serious. I am triggering a mandatory domestic violence protocol for a patient in Trauma Room 1. I have a 33-year-old female victim brought in by county plow workers. She was found abandoned in a snowbank in a remote residential area during the blizzard. She has severe hypothermia, early-stage frostbite, and physical bruising consistent with an assault. I need an officer down here immediately to take a statement and guard the room. The dispatcher confirmed an officer was already in the building, responding to a traffic collision, and would be down in exactly 2 minutes. Jamal hung up the phone. He took a deep breath, staring out at the chaotic emergency room, preparing himself for the hardest part of the night. He pulled his personal cell phone from his scrubs pocket and scrolled through his contacts until he found David's name. His thumb hovered over the call button. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drive up to that mountain cabin himself and drag David out into the snow by his throat. But Jamal was a professional. He knew that if David panicked, he and Brenda might try to flee or destroy evidence at the cabin. Jamal had to play this perfectly. He had to trap him. He tapped the call button and pressed the phone to his ear. It rang 3 times before David answered. Jamal, David said, his voice dripping with forced casualness, loudly chewing on what sounded like a piece of steak. "Hey man, you working the night shift? It is a crazy storm out there. We are just sitting by the fire." The sheer audacity of the man eating a warm meal while his wife was dying on a steel table nearly broke Jamal's composure. He gripped the edge of the charting desk so hard his knuckles turned white. He forced his voice to become completely devoid of emotion, adopting the cold, clinical tone he used when delivering terrible news to strangers. "David, I am calling from Aspen General Hospital," Jamal said, his voice flat. "You need to come down to the emergency room immediately." The chewing stopped. There was a pause on the line. Why, David asked, a hint of nervous hesitation creeping into his voice. "What is going on? Did something happen to Simone or the kids?" "Simone and the children are fine," Jamal replied instantly, cutting off that avenue of panic. "This is regarding Natalie." Another heavy pause. When David finally spoke, his tone shifted from nervous to defensive and annoyed. "Look, whatever she told you, it is a lie. She is causing drama. My mother and I kicked her out a few hours ago because we caught her stealing from us. I am not driving all the way down the mountain in a blizzard just because she is crying in a hospital lobby trying to get sympathy. She is not in the lobby." David, Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a dark, unquestionable authority. "And this is not a request. As her legal next of kin, you are required to be here. Get in your car, put chains on your tires, drive slowly, but get to the emergency department right now." Before David could utter another pathetic excuse, Jamal pulled the phone away from his ear and ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. He looked up just in time to see a uniformed Aspen police officer walking through the double doors heading straight toward his desk. The trap was set. Now all Jamal had to do was wait for the rat to walk through the front door. 45 minutes later, the main sliding doors of the Aspen General Hospital emergency room glided open. David walked in aggressively, brushing fresh snow off the shoulders of his expensive wool overcoat. He looked around the chaotic waiting area with an expression of deep annoyance, as if the bleeding, injured people around him were nothing but a personal inconvenience. He marched straight past the line of waiting patients and slammed his leather-gloved hand down on the triage reception desk. "I am looking for my wife, Natalie," he demanded, using his commanding corporate voice. "She is probably sitting in a corner crying and claiming she is freezing. Tell her to pack up her little show. I am double parked out front and I am not staying long." The triage nurse did not even blink at his arrogance. She simply pointed her pen down the long, brightly lit corridor. "Trauma Room 1. But you need to wait for security clearance to enter that bay." David scoffed, ignoring the nurse completely. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt and strode confidently down the hallway. He fully expected to find Natalie sitting on a standard hospital bed wrapped in a blanket, ready to apologize for embarrassing him. He had his speech already prepared in his head. He was going to demand she sign over the cabin deed before he ever let her back into his life. But as he rounded the corner to Trauma Room 1, his confident stride suddenly broke. Standing directly outside the sliding glass doors of the trauma bay was a fully uniformed Aspen police officer. The officer had his arms crossed over his tactical vest, his posture rigid and alert. David slowed his pace, his arrogant sneer faltering into a look of genuine confusion. He approached the door, reaching for the handle. "Hold it right there, sir," the officer barked, stepping directly into David's path and placing a heavy hand on his chest. "This is a restricted medical area. State your name and business." "I am David, her husband," he stammered, the authoritative corporate edge suddenly vanishing from his voice. "What is going on here? Why are the police guarding my wife's room? Is she trying to file a false report against me?" Before the officer could respond, the glass door slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss. Dr. Jamal stepped out into the hallway. His scrubs were stained with melting snow, and his face was set in a mask of absolute fury. He glared at David, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. "Let him in," Officer Jamal said, his voice dangerously low. The police officer stepped aside. David walked into the room, preparing to launch into his prepared tirade, but the words completely died in his throat. The trauma room looked like a battlefield. The floor was covered in wet, discarded medical packaging and the shredded remains of Natalie's clothes. And there, lying under a massive forced air-warming blanket, was his wife. She was hooked up to half a dozen flashing monitors, heated oxygen tubes, running across her pale face, her skin still carrying a terrifying waxy grayish hue. She did not look like a woman throwing a tantrum. She looked like a woman who had just fought her way back from the brink of death. "What the hell is this?" David whispered, staring at the thick intravenous lines pumping heated fluids into her arms. "You are blowing this out of proportion, Jamal. She was just out in the snow for a few minutes. She is just trying to make me look bad." Jamal did not say a single word. He closed the distance between them in two massive strides, raised the heavy metal medical clipboard, and slammed it violently into the center of David's chest. David stumbled backward from the force of the blow, gasping in complete shock. "Do not you ever speak about her like that in my hospital," Jamal growled, backing David up against the cold tiled wall. "Do you see those monitors, David?" Her core temperature was 82 degrees when the plow drivers pulled her out of the snowbank. "Do you know what happens to the human body at 82 degrees? The organs shut down. The heart goes into fatal arrhythmias." She was less than 10 minutes away from going into full cardiac arrest because you locked her outside in a historic blizzard without a coat or shoes. David raised his hands defensively, his face suddenly paling. "I did not know. My mother said she stole from us. I just wanted to teach her a lesson. I did not touch her. I am a regional director of a major investment fund. I would never do anything criminal." Jamal let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly in the trauma bay. "A regional director. You walk around in your tailored suits acting like you run the world, but you are nothing but a pathetic coward. You let your mother whisper lies into your ear, and you responded by trying to murder your own wife. Murder." David choked out his eyes, darting frantically toward the police officer standing just outside the glass. "Jamal, lower your voice. You cannot use words like that. It was a misunderstanding. She took $250,000. She is funding another man." The nurses in the room stopped what they were doing, turning to look at David with absolute undisguised disgust. Jamal stepped even closer, completely stripping away David's arrogant facade in front of the entire medical staff. "You really are the most gullible, spineless man I have ever met," Jamal said softly, the venom in his words cutting deeper than shouting ever could. "You think she stole your money to fund a secret lover? You think she is lying to you? Look at the ultrasound monitor on the wall, David. Look at what you almost killed tonight." David's eyes darted toward the brightly lit screen mounted above the trauma bed. He stared at the grainy black and white image pulsating on the monitor, but his mind was still furiously clinging to the narrative his mother had fed him. He blinked rapidly, his face twisting in a mixture of confusion and stubborn denial. He did not know how to read a medical sonogram. All he saw were blurry shapes and static. "What am I looking at?" David demanded, his voice shaking as he pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "Is this some kind of trick?" "My mother hired a private investigator, Jamal. I saw the documents with my own eyes. I saw the bank statements. $250,000 went missing from my mother's retirement fund, and Natalie was sending weekly wire transfers to a man named Dr. Evans. You cannot fake a bank statement. She is having an affair. She has been lying to me for months, and you are covering for her just because she got a little cold." Jamal did not yell. He did not need to. The quiet, terrifying calm in his voice was far more devastating than any shouting could ever be. He reached out, grabbed David tightly by the lapel of his expensive wool overcoat, and physically dragged him a step closer to the ultrasound machine. "You arrogant, pathetic excuse for a man," Jamal said, his words sharp and deliberate, cutting through David's frantic excuses. "Dr. Evans is not a secret lover. He is Dr. Richard Evans. He is the lead reproductive endocrinologist at the Aspen IVF fertility clinic." David froze. His arm dropped slowly to his side. The color began to drain completely from his face as the words hung heavy in the tense air of the trauma room. The arrogant corporate director persona evaporated instantly, leaving behind a terrified, confused little boy. "Fertility clinic." David echoed, his voice barely a hollow whisper. "What are you talking about? She did not steal a single dime from your mother," Jamal continued, his grip tightening on David's coat. "The money for those weekly transfers did not come from Brenda's retirement account. It came from Natalie's own year-end corporate bonuses from her firm. She used her own hard-earned money to pay for out-of-pocket, high-tier fertility treatments." "And do you know why she had to keep it a massive secret from you, David? Do you know why she went through the grueling hormone injections, the constant blood draws, and the painful egg retrievals completely alone?" David could only shake his head. His eyes were wide and panicked, staring blankly at the black and white image on the monitor as his entire reality began to fracture. "Because she knew you could not handle the truth," Jamal practically spat the words at him, his disgust uncontainable. "She did it because your sperm count was too low to conceive naturally. The medical issue was yours, not hers. She knew your fragile, toxic ego would completely shatter if your overbearing mother ever found out that her perfect golden son was the reason you two were not having children. Natalie carried the immense financial burden, the physical pain, and the emotional isolation, all just to protect your pride from your own family." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the emergency room. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the soft hum of the forced air warming blanket covering Natalie's shivering body. The trauma nurses stood completely still, watching the absolute destruction of a man who had walked in acting like he owned the building. Just outside the glass doors, the police officer remained stoic, his hand resting near his duty belt, taking in every single word of the confession. David's breathing turned ragged. He looked down at the hospital bed, really looking at Natalie for the first time since he had dragged her suitcase to the door. He saw the harsh red friction burns on her neck from the freezing wind. He saw the dark purple bruising on her arms where he had shoved her. And then he looked back up at the monitor, the reality of the small flickering heartbeat on the screen finally piercing through his thick skull. "She is 8 weeks pregnant," David Jamal said, his voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "She was carrying your child, and you locked her outside in a historic blizzard to freeze to death." The air seemed to completely leave David's lungs. His knees physically buckled under the crushing weight of the revelation. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the wet linoleum floor until his back hit the cold, tiled wall of the trauma bay. He slid down the wall, his hands violently grabbing the sides of his own head. "No!" David gasped, his chest heaving as a raw, ugly sob ripped through his throat. "No, that cannot be true. My mother said she was stealing. My mother promised me she saw the evidence. She promised me." Jamal stood towering over him, his expression devoid of any sympathy. Your mother lied to you to cover up her own mess, and you were too weak to even ask your wife for her side of the story. You let your mother pull the strings, and you almost committed murder tonight. David squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face as the absolute magnitude of his horrific mistake consumed him. He wept uncontrollably on the floor of the emergency room, utterly broken. But the night was far from over. The sound of David weeping echoed off the sterile walls of the trauma bay, a pathetic wet sound that completely shattered whatever remained of his dignified corporate image. He curled into himself on the cold linoleum floor, his expensive wool coat pooling around him like a discarded rag. His chest heaved with violent gasping sobs as the full weight of his actions finally crushed the breath out of his lungs. He had always wanted a child. He had spent years feeling quietly inadequate, harboring a deep secret shame about his fertility issues. And now he realized that his wife had not only absorbed that shame to protect his pride, but she had literally paid for the solution with her own money. In return, he had locked her out in the snow to die. David pressed his face into his hands, his shoulders shaking uncontrollably. The realization that his mother had orchestrated the entire scenario tore through his mind. Brenda had weaponized his insecurities. She had manufactured the bank statements, hired the investigator, and spun a web of lies so perfectly tailored to his deepest fears that he had swallowed the bait without a single question. He had acted as his mother's executioner, and he had nearly killed his own unborn child in the process. On the trauma bed, the steady rhythm of the cardiac monitor suddenly shifted. The slow, sluggish beeping began to pick up a faster, more stable pace. Underneath the thick plastic of the forced air warming blanket, Natalie's fingers twitched. Her heavy eyelids fluttered, fighting against the blinding glare of the surgical lights overhead. The suffocating, hazy fog of hypothermia that had pulled her into the dark was finally burning away. The heated intravenous fluids pumping directly into her veins had done their job. Her core temperature was stabilizing, and as the warm blood rushed back to her brain, it brought with it a sudden razor-sharp clarity. Natalie turned her head slowly against the stiff hospital pillow. She did not groan in pain. She did not cry. She simply opened her eyes and took in the room with the calculating, methodical precision of a forensic accountant assessing a crime scene. She saw the discarded, shredded remains of her freezing clothes in the biohazard bin. She saw Dr. Jamal standing tall and furious near the foot of her bed. She saw the uniformed police officer standing guard just outside the sliding glass doors. And finally she looked down at the floor beside her bed. She saw David. Hearing the slight rustle of the warming blanket, David raised his head. His face was a bloated red mask of absolute misery. Tears streamed down his cheeks, dripping off his chin onto his tailored shirt. When he saw that her eyes were open, a desperate, pathetic noise escaped his throat. "Natalie," he choked out, his voice cracking as he scrambled onto his knees. He grabbed the cold metal railing of the hospital bed, his knuckles white as he pulled himself up to look at her. "Oh my God, Natalie, you are awake. I am so sorry. I did not know. My mother lied to me. She showed me fake papers. I swear to God I did not know about the baby." He reached out a trembling hand, desperately trying to grab her fingers protruding from under the warming blanket. He expected her to do what she had done for the last 5 years. He expected her to soften. He expected her to reach back to stroke his hand, to offer a quiet word of forgiveness, and help him regulate his own emotional mess. But Natalie did not move a single muscle. She looked at his outstretched hand, and then she looked directly into his tear-filled eyes. Her gaze was not warm. It was not forgiving. It was entirely dead. The terrified, freezing woman who had pounded on the heavy oak door of the cabin, begging her husband for her life, was gone. That woman had died in the snowdrift. The woman lying on the hospital bed now felt nothing but a cold, absolute detachment. "Do not touch me," Natalie said. Her voice was incredibly raspy from the heated oxygen tube, barely above a whisper, but it carried a sharp, commanding authority that made David instantly recoil. He pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, his eyes widening in shock at the pure ice in her tone. "Natalie, please," he begged, fresh tears spilling over his eyelashes. "You have to understand. I was out of my mind. I thought you were draining our accounts. I thought you were leaving me. Please let me make this right. We are having a baby. We can fix this. I will cut my mother off completely, I promise." Natalie stared at him, letting his desperate promises hang in the sterile air. She felt a profound sense of disgust. He was not apologizing for trying to kill her. He was apologizing because he had found out she was pregnant and innocent. If she had actually spent the money, he would still be sitting by the fireplace right now, feeling completely justified in his cruelty. She shifted her gaze away from him, completely dismissing his existence, and looked at Jamal. The emotional shift was complete. She was no longer a victim surviving a blizzard. She was a tactician preparing for war, and she knew exactly what move to make next. Before Jamal could respond to my silent command, a loud commotion erupted in the hospital corridor outside the glass doors. The sharp, authoritative sound of a triage nurse yelling a warning was instantly cut off as the heavy doors of Trauma Room 1 were shoved open with violent, reckless force. Brenda stormed into the room. She was still wearing her pristine white cashmere cardigan and her expensive tailored slacks, though the shoulders of her sweater were now dark and damp with melted snow from the frantic drive down the mountain. Her hair, usually sprayed and styled into a perfect helmet of high society elegance, was windblown and erratic. You would think a mother walking into a trauma center and seeing her grown son weeping uncontrollably on the floor would immediately rush to his side. You would think she might at least glance at the flashing medical monitors, keeping her daughter-in-law alive, or notice the uniformed police officer standing guard just a few feet away. But Brenda did none of those things. Her eyes swept the brightly lit room with a wild, frantic desperation, completely ignoring David. She completely ignored the steady beeping of the heart rate monitor above my head. She did not even spare a single glance at my pale, bruised face, or the thick intravenous tubes pumping heated fluids into my arms. Her manic gaze bypassed all the human suffering in the room and locked instantly onto a gray plastic hospital basin sitting on a metal chair in the far corner. Inside that basin were the soaked, ruined remains of my clothing that the trauma nurses had rapidly cut away to save my life, including the heavy winter coat I had desperately tried to grab before David locked the deadbolt. Brenda practically sprinted across the wet linoleum floor. Her expensive leather boots slipped slightly on the slick tiles, but she caught herself against the wall and lunged directly for the plastic basin. She grabbed my heavy, waterlogged coat with both hands, dragging it out of the pile, and began tearing through the pockets like a starving animal digging for scraps. "What are you doing?" David croaked from the floor, his voice thick with tears and utter confusion. "Mom, what are you doing here?" She did not answer him. She did not even acknowledge that he had spoken. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, echoing loudly in the tense silence of the trauma bay. She plunged her manicured hands deep into the left pocket of my coat, aggressively pulling out a soaked pair of winter gloves and throwing them carelessly onto the floor. She dug violently into the right pocket, her sharp acrylic nails ripping the inner silk lining in her frantic haste. She pulled out my frozen waterlogged cell phone and tossed it aside so hard it cracked against the metal baseboards. "Hey, step away from the patient belongings right now," the police officer barked, stepping firmly into the room with his hand resting on his utility belt. Brenda ignored the officer completely. She flipped the heavy wet coat over her hands, trembling violently as she searched the interior chest pockets. Her face, usually a carefully constructed mask of arrogant superiority, was twisted in raw, unfiltered panic. She patted down the soaked cashmere sweater still sitting in the basin. She lifted the plastic bin itself, checking beneath the wet clothes, her movements becoming more frantic and erratic with every empty pocket she found. "Where is it?" she muttered to herself, her voice a frantic, breathy hiss that carried across the room. Where did she put it? She turned the heavy coat upside down, shaking it violently, as if the item she so desperately needed might magically fall out of the torn lining. Nothing fell out except a few drops of dirty, melting snow. The panic in her eyes rapidly deepened into sheer, unadulterated terror. She dropped the ruined coat onto the wet floor and backed away from it, her chest heaving as she stared at the empty pockets. I said step away from her things, the police officer warned again, moving closer to physically intervene. Jamal stepped directly between Brenda and the pile of ruined clothes, using his tall frame to block her path. He looked down at his mother-in-law with a mixture of deep disgust and absolute bewilderment. "What exactly are you looking for?" Brenda Jamal asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Did you really drive all the way down the mountain in a deadly blizzard, just to dig through the pockets of the woman you tried to kill?" David slowly pushed himself off the wet floor, leaning heavily against the wall for support. His red, swollen eyes darted between his frantic mother and the pile of my destroyed clothing scattered across the tiles. The gears in his head, usually completely paralyzed by his mother's overbearing influence, were finally starting to turn. "Mom," David rasped, staring at her shaking hands with a look of dawning horror. "Natalie did not steal from you. Jamal showed me the medical records. She is pregnant. She used her own money for fertility treatments. Why did you tell me she was wiring money to another man?" Brenda finally stopped her frantic searching and looked at her son. For a split second, the mask slipped completely, and I saw the pure, calculating malice underneath. She was backed into a corner, and a cornered animal is always the most dangerous. She did not look guilty. She looked furious that she had not found what she needed to completely destroy me. I watched her from my hospital bed, feeling the slow, deeply satisfying warmth of total control washing over my mind. Let her look, I thought to myself. She will never find it in those pockets. Brenda straightened her posture, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her white cashmere cardigan. The frantic desperation that had consumed her just seconds ago vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, calculating arrogance. She stepped over my ruined coat, ignoring the pool of melting snow on the floor, and turned her sharp, piercing gaze toward David. "Are you really this gullible, David?" Brenda snapped, her voice echoing off the cold, sterile walls of the trauma bay. "Do you actually believe a single word coming out of this woman's mouth? She is completely manipulating you. She is manipulating all of you." David flinched instinctively, leaning harder against the tiled wall. "But Mom, the ultrasound?" he stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward the monitor above my hospital bed. Jamal showed me the medical records. "She is actually pregnant. She paid for the clinic by herself." Brenda let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made the trauma nurses exchange worried glances. "Oh, please. You think a blurry picture on a hospital screen proves anything? Do not you see what she is doing, David? She knew I hired a private investigator. She knew she was caught stealing from my retirement accounts, so she invented this miraculous pregnancy to trap you and secure her claim to the family trust fund before we could throw her out of the cabin." I watched her from the bed, absolutely fascinated by her sheer audacity. She had been caught red-handed destroying my belongings and lying about the stolen money, yet she was doubling down, spinning a new web of lies right in front of a police officer. She staged this whole freezing victim routine. Brenda continued, her voice rising in pitch as she pointed an accusing finger directly at me. "She probably walked out into the snow barefoot on purpose, just to make you look like a monster and gain sympathy from the hospital staff. It is a pathetic, desperate grab for our family money." Jamal crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw set in a rigid line. "Brenda, you are completely delusional," Jamal said, his voice a low, warning growl. "I admitted her into this emergency room. I treated her myself. She had a core temperature of 82 degrees when the plow drivers brought her in. You do not fake severe hypothermia. Now step away from my patient before I have hospital security drag you out of this building in handcuffs." Brenda completely ignored the attending physician. She reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a crisp manila folder. She marched right past Jamal, slammed the folder heavily down onto the rolling tray table at the foot of my bed. She flipped the thick folder open with a dramatic flourish. Inside was a stack of legal documents printed on high-quality paper with bright yellow sticky notes marking the required signature lines. "I knew you would pull a manipulative stunt like this eventually." Brenda sneered, leaning over the tray table to glare directly into my eyes. So I came prepared. This is a pre-drafted divorce settlement and a strict non-disclosure agreement. She picked up a black plastic pen from the nurse station counter and threw it onto the papers. It clattered loudly against the plastic tray. You are going to sign these legal papers right now, Natalie. Brenda demanded, her eyes wide and manic. You are going to sign away any claim to the Aspen Cabin property, any claim to David's investment portfolio, and any right to speak about our family to the press or the authorities. If you sign this right now, I will personally pay your hospital bills, and I will give you a $50,000 severance check to disappear from our lives forever. David pushed himself off the wall, his swollen eyes darting between the legal documents and my pale, bruised face. Mom, you cannot do this right now, he whispered, his voice cracking under the pressure. She almost died out there. You cannot force her to sign a divorce paper in the emergency room. Shut up, David, Brenda snapped, not even bothering to look at her weeping son. I am saving you from a gold-digging parasite. If she does not sign this contract right now, I swear to God I will hire the most ruthless corporate lawyers. We will bury you in endless litigation, Natalie. We will drag your precious accounting firm through the mud. We will ruin your professional reputation, and we will make sure you do not get a single dime in alimony. She leaned in much closer, the smell of expensive perfume and cheap wine rolling off her breath. The choice is yours, Brenda whispered viciously. Take the cash and run, or lose absolutely everything you have ever worked for. The room was dead silent after Brenda delivered her vicious ultimatum. David looked completely terrified, his back pressed hard against the wall. Jamal looked ready to call the hospital security team to physically drag her out. But as I sat there listening to her threaten to destroy my career and bury me in endless litigation, I did not feel a single ounce of fear. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute clarity. The freezing fog that had clouded my brain was entirely gone. I reached up with a trembling hand and carefully adjusted the oxygen mask on my face, sliding it down to rest loosely around my neck so I could speak clearly. Despite the heavy intravenous lines taped to my forearms and the lingering painful chill deep in my bones, I slowly pushed myself up. The medical bed creaked as I forced myself to sit fully upright against the stiff hospital pillows, refusing to cower beneath her gaze. You want to ruin my professional reputation, Brenda? I asked. My voice was raspy but steady and chillingly calm. It sounded completely foreign to my own ears, entirely devoid of the eager-to-please tone I had used with her for the past 5 years. That is a very interesting threat coming from a woman who just spent the last 10 minutes desperately tearing through my ruined coat like a common thief in an alleyway. Brenda narrowed her eyes, her manicured hand resting aggressively on the stack of legal documents she had thrown on my tray table. I do not know what you are talking about, she sneered. I was looking for my son's house keys, so you cannot try to sneak back into our cabin. Just sign the papers, Natalie, and we can all move on with our lives. I did not look at the divorce papers. I reached my right hand toward the neckline of my hospital gown. When the paramedics had cut away my freezing clothes in the back of the ambulance, they had left the small waterproof lanyard I always wore around my neck during my trips to the Aspen cabin. I pulled it out from under the thin cotton fabric. Dangling from the end of the black cord was a small, heavy-duty, titanium-encrypted USB drive. Looking for this, Brenda, I asked, holding the small silver drive up directly under the harsh fluorescent surgical lights. The blood completely drained from Brenda's face. Her arrogant, mocking sneer vanished in a split second, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She took a sudden, involuntary step backward, her hip knocking violently into her expensive leather tote bag. The bag tipped over, sending her carefully drafted divorce documents and non-disclosure agreements scattering uselessly across the wet linoleum floor. "Give that to me," Brenda demanded, her voice suddenly high-pitched and frantic. She lunged forward, reaching her perfectly manicured hands toward the lanyard around my neck. Jamal was much faster. He stepped right in front of my hospital bed, throwing his strong arm out and physically shoving Brenda back by her shoulder. "Do not take another step toward my patient," Jamal warned, his deep voice vibrating with absolute authority. I let the heavy titanium USB drive rest against my chest. "You always called my career a little bookkeeping hobby, Brenda. You loved telling all your wealthy country club friends that I just did basic taxes for small local businesses. But you conveniently forgot what an independent forensic accountant actually does. My firm specializes in investigating corporate fraud, complex embezzlement schemes, and money laundering. We hunt down stolen money for a living, and we are very, very good at it." David was staring at the USB drive dangling from my neck, completely lost in the rapid shift of power. "What is on that drive, Natalie?" he asked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "What is going on?" "It is the complete finalized financial audit of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association," I said, never taking my eyes off Brenda. "2 months ago, several of your neighbors hired my firm independently. They noticed that the community maintenance funds were constantly being depleted, yet the promised repairs to the neighborhood were never actually being made. They asked me to look into the books. Since your mother has been the president of the HOA board for the last 4 years, she had sole signatory authority over their operating accounts." "Shut up!" Brenda screamed, her carefully maintained composure completely shattering into a million pieces. "David, do not listen to a word she says. She is making this all up to destroy our family." But David was not looking at his mother anymore. He was staring directly at me, the terrifying puzzle pieces finally snapping together in his mind. "I knew you were coming up to the cabin this weekend, Brenda," I continued, my voice echoing clearly over the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. "I knew you would try to snoop through my laptop to see exactly how far along my investigation was. That is why I encrypted the final report and kept the physical drive hidden on my person at all times. You did not lock me out in a deadly blizzard because you thought I was cheating on your son. You locked me out to die because you realized I had finally found the missing money and you needed to silence me permanently before I handed this drive over to the authorities." David stood frozen, his eyes darting between me and the silver drive hanging from my neck. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was finally seeing his mother for exactly who she was. Not the pristine, devoted matriarch he had worshipped for 35 years, but a desperate, calculating criminal backed into a corner. I did not even need to plug the drive into a computer. After weeks of meticulously tracking the money, the numbers were permanently burned into my memory. "Routing number 021000089. I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the trauma room with surgical precision. "That is the routing number for a shell company registered under the name Apex Consulting Group. For the last 2 years, Apex Consulting has been submitting monthly invoices to the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association for specialized landscape architecture and community maintenance. But Apex Consulting does not own a single lawnmower. It does not have any employees. It is a ghost company registered to a virtual post office box in Delaware. And the sole managing member of that limited liability company is you, Brenda." Brenda pressed her back tightly against the wall, her face pale and glistening with cold sweat. She looked like she was going to be sick right there on the hospital floor. "But the community funds were not enough to cover your habits, were they?" I continued, leaning slightly forward on the hospital bed. "The gambling debts kept piling up. You were playing high-stakes underground poker games in the city, losing tens of thousands of dollars every single weekend. When the neighbors started asking questions about the depleted neighborhood funds, you panicked. You needed to replenish the accounts quickly before an official inquiry was launched. So you turned to the easiest, most trusting target you had: your own son." David gripped the edge of a rolling medical cart, his knuckles turning stark white. "What are you saying?" he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "She took my money." "She drained your money, David," I corrected him, keeping my icy gaze locked on Brenda. "She still had legacy access to your primary investment portfolio and your early retirement accounts from before we were married. You never removed her as a financial proxy because you trusted her completely. 3 months ago, she authorized a massive liquidation of your long-term assets. $250,000 was transferred out of your accounts in a series of structured wire transfers deliberately kept under the $10,000 limit to avoid triggering federal banking alerts. I watched the realization hit David like a physical blow to the chest. He gasped, his legs buckling slightly as he realized his life savings were completely gone. The money was funneled directly into Apex Consulting, I explained, laying out the undeniable logic of the wire fraud for everyone in the room to hear. From there, Brenda paid off her massive gambling markers. But she knew that eventually you would check your quarterly statements and notice the missing $250,000. She needed a scapegoat. She needed a distraction so massive and emotionally devastating that you would never even think to look at the routing numbers on the transfers. I pointed to the floor where the fake bank statements she had brought were currently soaking in a puddle of melted snow. That is when she noticed my regular quiet withdrawals, I said. She saw that I was moving my own money to the Aspen Fertility Clinic. It was the perfect opportunity. She fabricated those bank statements you are looking at right now. She altered the destination of your missing retirement funds, pasting my name and Dr. Evans over the actual routing data. She hired a fake private investigator to tell you a horrifying story about a secret lover. She knew that your toxic pride and your deep insecurities about having children would completely blind you. She knew you would explode with rage and throw me out without ever verifying the financial data yourself. You are a liar, Brenda screamed, her voice cracking in pure desperation. She lunged forward again, pointing a shaking finger at me. You are making all of this up. It is hearsay. You have absolutely no proof. It is all documented on this drive, I said calmly, dropping the titanium USB back against my chest. Every single fraudulent wire transfer, every fake invoice, the Internet Protocol addresses used to authorize the liquidations, and the digital signatures linking everything directly to your personal devices. The paper trail is absolutely bulletproof. I spent the last 3 weeks verifying every single transaction with the bank fraud departments. You did not just steal from your neighbors, Brenda. You committed massive federal wire fraud and identity theft. The police officer standing by the door had his hand resting firmly on his radio, now listening intently to the confession. Brenda looked at the officer, then at Jamal, and finally at her son. But there was no salvation left for her in this room. The financial web she had spent years building had just been completely dismantled in less than 5 minutes. I kept my eyes locked on Brenda, but my next words were meant entirely for the man standing near the foot of my bed. Apex Consulting was just the primary funnel. I explained, my voice echoing steadily over the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors. But Brenda knew that wiring $250,000 directly into an underground casino account would instantly trigger a federal money laundering investigation. The money had to be washed. She needed a secondary holding company, a clean limited liability company that could receive the funds from Apex, mask the transaction as a legitimate real estate investment, and then quietly disperse the money to her creditors without raising suspicion. I paused, taking a slow, steady breath of the heated oxygen. The secondary company she used is called Crestview Property Management. I watched Dr. Jamal physically stiffen. The deep, authoritative scowl on his face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. He slowly turned his head away from the shattered remnants of my clothing on the floor and looked directly at me. His dark eyes were wide, completely devoid of their usual clinical detachment. "What did you just say?" Jamal asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating whisper that seemed to chill the warm air of the trauma bay. "Crestview Property Management." I repeated clearly, enunciating every single syllable. "The sole managing director listed on the state incorporation documents is your wife, Simone." The silence that followed was so absolute, it felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. David, still huddled against the cold tiled wall, let out a pathetic whimper of confusion, completely unable to process this devastating new layer of deceit. Jamal took a slow, heavy step backward, shaking his head in a desperate attempt to deny the reality crashing down upon him. No, that is impossible. Simone is a stay-at-home mother. She does not run a property management company. She does not know the first thing about corporate finance or shell companies. She did not need to know anything about finance, Jamal. I told him gently, feeling a genuine pang of sympathy for the brilliant doctor who had just worked so frantically to save my life. She just needed to sign the incorporation paperwork and open the commercial bank accounts. Brenda could not put her own name on the secondary accounts without triggering a massive red flag with the Homeowners Association auditors. She needed a clean proxy. She needed someone whose financial background was pristine and who trusted her unconditionally. She used her own daughter to wash the stolen money. Brenda practically threw herself against the wall, her hands waving frantically in front of her face. She is lying. Simone had nothing to do with this. She did not know what the accounts were for. I just told her it was a tax strategy for the family trust. I told her I was protecting our assets. But Jamal was not listening to Brenda's pathetic screeching excuses. He ripped his personal cell phone out of his scrub's pocket with trembling hands. His thumbs flew across the screen, rapidly pulling up his own joint banking application. The bright artificial light of the screen illuminated the absolute devastation setting into his strong features. I audited those accounts too, Jamal, I said softly, delivering the final crushing blow. I am so sorry. You need to check the educational savings trusts you set up for your 2 children. Jamal let out a sharp, choked gasp. His broad shoulders slumped forward as he stared at the digital numbers on his phone screen. The college funds were gone. The accounts that he had worked grueling 80-hour emergency room shifts to build the money he had bled for to secure his children's future had been systematically drained over the last 6 months. Simone had liquidated their children's future and funneled every single cent into Crestview Property Management to help cover her mother's spiraling gambling debts. My own wife, Jamal, whispered the words tearing out of his throat like shattered glass. She stole from our kids to pay for your poker games. Jamal, please, Brenda begged, taking a cautious, desperate step toward him. Simone was just trying to help me. I was in deep trouble with some very dangerous people in the city. They were threatening me. I promised her I would pay it all back before the kids were old enough to go to college. You have to understand we are family. Jamal slowly raised his head from the phone screen. The look in his eyes was no longer that of a composed medical professional. It was the look of a father who had just watched his entire world be destroyed by the greed of the woman standing in front of him. He turned around, his heavy medical clogs squeaking sharply against the wet linoleum floor, but he did not walk toward Brenda. He walked directly to the heavy glass sliding doors of the trauma room. He stepped outside into the hallway, grabbed the thick metal handles, and yanked both doors completely shut with a deafening crash. He then planted his large frame directly in front of the exit, crossing his massive arms over his chest like an impenetrable brick wall. Nobody is leaving this room, Jamal said, his voice echoing with absolute terrifying finality through the glass. Brenda let out a high-pitched shriek of panic. She scrambled toward the door, her expensive leather tote bag completely forgotten on the puddle-covered floor. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands against the thick glass. Jamal, let me out of here. You cannot hold me in here. That is kidnapping. Officer, make him move. The police officer, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange with his hand resting on his utility belt, simply unclipped the heavy two-way radio from his shoulder holster. He did not look at Brenda. He looked directly at me. Ma'am? The officer said, his voice deep and authoritative over the frantic pounding on the glass. You said you have digital proof of these financial crimes on that drive. I nodded, my fingers wrapping tightly around the cool titanium metal hanging from my neck. Bank statements, internet protocol logs, forged invoices, and digital signatures linking Brenda and Simone to the fraud. It is all right here. The officer pressed the button on his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I am going to need 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Division sent down to Aspen General Hospital immediately. The crackle of the police radio seemed to finally break the spell that had frozen David against the wall. The words Financial Crimes Division hung in the air heavier than the freezing snowstorm raging outside. Brenda let out a pathetic, suffocating gasp and slid slowly down the thick glass of the trauma room door, collapsing into a heap on the wet linoleum floor. Her pristine white cashmere sweater was ruined, her arrogant facade entirely destroyed. But I was not watching Brenda anymore. I was watching my husband. I expected David to turn his back on her. I expected the man who had just wept on the floor begging for my forgiveness to finally realize the monster his mother truly was. I expected him to be outraged that she had stolen his life savings and tried to freeze his pregnant wife to death. But as he looked from the police officer back to the titanium drive resting on my chest, I saw something else entirely flash across his swollen eyes. It was not righteous anger. It was sheer, unadulterated self-preservation. David pushed himself off the wall and took a slow step toward my hospital bed. He straightened his shoulders, instinctively adjusting the lapels of his expensive wool coat. The weeping, apologetic husband vanished in an instant, replaced entirely by the ruthless regional director of a Wall Street investment fund. He was doing the mental math. If Brenda went down for federal wire fraud and money laundering, his accounts would be subpoenaed. His name would be plastered across the financial news. The scandal would trigger an automatic ethics investigation at his firm. His entire social standing, his unvested stock options, his pristine country club reputation, everything he valued more than me would be instantly vaporized. "Natalie, we need to stop this right now," David said. His voice was no longer trembling. It was hard, cold, and entirely devoid of any empathy. "You are acting completely irrationally. You are letting your emotions dictate a situation that requires a strategic corporate mindset." Jamal immediately stepped away from the door and moved toward David, his fists clenching at his sides. "Do not take another step toward her, David," Jamal warned. "Stay out of this," David snapped, not even turning his head to look at his brother-in-law. "This is a private marital dispute." Natalie listened to me very carefully. "You are not going to hand that encrypted drive over to those detectives. You are going to tell that police officer that you were confused and made a mistake. We are going to handle this internally as a family." I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. "Handle it as a family?" I repeated, my voice raspy but firm. "Your mother just tried to murder me, to cover up a $250,000 theft, and your only concern is your corporate image. My image pays for your lifestyle," David hissed, stepping right up to the edge of the medical bed. His face twisted into an ugly, threatening sneer. "Let us drop the Righteous Victim Act. If you hand that drive to the police and drag my name into a federal investigation, I will absolutely destroy you. You think you hold all the cards because you found some missing money. You do not. I am the primary earner. I hold the power." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so the police officer near the door could not hear the viciousness of his threats. "If you do not make this go away right now, I will call human resources at my firm the second I walk out of this hospital and cancel your premium health insurance. Good luck paying for an emergency trauma resuscitation, a week in the intensive care unit, and out-of-pocket fertility clinic bills without my corporate coverage. You will be entirely bankrupt before the baby is even born." He placed his hands flat on my tray table, looming over me in a pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. "And do not even think about keeping this child away from me," he whispered maliciously. "My firm retains the most aggressive, expensive family law attorneys in the state of Colorado. I will drag you through family court for years. I will paint you as a mentally unstable woman who wandered out into a blizzard barefoot. I have the financial resources to outlast you. I will take full custody of the baby, and you will have absolutely nothing." The room fell dead silent. David stood there, his chest heaving fully, believing he had just played a masterful winning hand. He expected me to crumble. He expected the fear of financial ruin and the threat of losing my unborn child to force me back into the obedient, quiet wife he had controlled for 5 years. Instead of crying, I felt the corners of my mouth slowly curl upward. A genuine, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a woman who had just watched her enemy walk blindly into a devastating trap. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head away from his flushed, angry face and looked at my brother-in-law. "Jamal," I said calmly, my tone completely unbothered by the venomous threats hanging in the air. "My cell phone is in the side pocket of my leather purse the paramedics brought in. Could you please pass it to me? It is time to make a phone call." Jamal walked over to the stainless steel medical cart where my belongings had been hastily dumped by the triage nurses. He picked up my waterlogged leather purse, reached into the dry inner zipper pocket, and pulled out my cell phone. He handed it to me without saying a single word, keeping his massive frame deliberately positioned between my hospital bed and David. David scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest in a desperate attempt to maintain his crumbling authority. "Go ahead," he mocked, a nervous, jagged edge creeping into his arrogant voice. "Call your little local lawyer. Call whoever you want. They will tell you exactly what I just told you. You do not have the financial resources to fight my firm. I will bury you." I did not respond to his pathetic taunts. I unlocked my phone and swiped down on the home screen. Instead of opening the dialer to call an attorney, I tapped the screen mirroring icon. A second later, the large, flat-screen smart television mounted on the wall directly above my bed, usually reserved for displaying patient x-rays and medical sonograms, flickered to life. My phone screen was now perfectly mirrored on the 50-inch display for everyone in the trauma room to see. I opened a highly secure, encrypted corporate communication application. I scrolled past a dozen high-profile contacts and tapped on a single name: Harrison Caldwell. The video call began to ring. The digital chiming echoed loudly through the television speakers, filling the tense, heavy silence of the emergency room. David glanced up at the large screen, his mocking smirk faltering. "What are you doing?" he demanded, taking a half-step forward. "Who are you calling?" Before I could answer him, the ringing stopped. The screen transitioned from a black loading screen to a crystal-clear, high-definition video feed. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk in a brightly lit, luxurious Manhattan corner office was an older, distinguished man with silver hair, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. "Good evening, Natalie Harrison," said his deep, authoritative voice booming through the hospital room speakers. "I was not expecting your preliminary audit report until Monday morning. Is everything all right? You look like you are in a hospital bed." When David heard that voice, the last remaining trace of color completely vanished from his face. His jaw literally dropped. His arms, previously crossed in arrogant defiance, fell limply to his sides. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into the rolling medical tray and sending a plastic cup clattering to the wet linoleum floor. David knew exactly who was on that television screen. Harrison Caldwell was the chief executive officer of the massive Wall Street investment fund where David worked. He was the man who signed David's lucrative paychecks, the man who controlled his unvested stock options, and the man whose corporate lawyers David had just maliciously threatened to unleash on me. "I am fine, Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and entirely professional, despite the oxygen tube still resting around my neck. "I apologize for the late hour. We had a severe winter storm here in Aspen, and I had a brief medical emergency. But I am calling you right now because a highly sensitive compliance issue has just come to light regarding one of your regional directors." Harrison leaned forward on the video feed, his demeanor shifting instantly from cordial to strictly business. "I am listening," he said. David suddenly found his voice. It was a pathetic, high-pitched squeak of absolute terror. "Mr. Caldwell?" he stammered frantically, waving his shaking hands at the television screen. "Sir, it is David from the Rocky Mountain Regional Branch. This is a massive misunderstanding. My wife is heavily medicated right now. She does not know what she is saying." Harrison adjusted his reading glasses, squinting slightly at the camera feed. David, what on earth are you doing in Natalie's hospital room? I looked directly at my terrified husband delivering the checkmate move I had been quietly holding on to for weeks. David was under the impression that my accounting firm only handled small homeowners association audits, I explained to the CEO. I did not have the chance to tell him the good news about my recent promotion yet. I turned my eyes back to the television screen. Harrison, would you mind clarifying the current professional relationship between your investment fund and my forensic accounting firm for my husband? Not at all, Harrison replied, his voice echoing with absolute corporate finality. As of last Tuesday, the board of directors officially retained Vanguard Forensic as our new independent risk management and compliance auditor. Natalie is leading the task force. She has full unrestricted access to every single regional director's financial records, expense accounts, and internal communications. Her job is to root out corporate fraud. David looked like he had just been struck by a speeding train. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. The arrogant threat he had made just 2 minutes ago about using his firm to bankrupt me now hung in the cold air like a sick, twisted joke. I was not just a small-time bookkeeper. I was the financial watchdog hired by the most powerful man in his company to investigate him. Harrison's silver eyebrows drew together, creating a deep crease above his nose. He leaned closer to the camera, the casual evening demeanor completely replaced by the ruthless calculation of a Wall Street titan. What exactly did you find in his financial records? Natalie Harrison asked, his voice dead serious. I kept my eyes on David, watching the absolute horror paralyze his features. During my independent audit of a local homeowners association, I traced $250,000 in embezzled funds, I explained to the CEO. The money was stolen by Brenda David's mother to cover massive underground gambling debts. But the compliance issue for your firm, Harrison, is how the money was washed. David allowed his mother to maintain legacy access to his executive investment portfolios, and his firm sponsored early retirement accounts. She used his corporate banking ecosystem to liquidate the assets and funnel the cash through 2 separate unregistered shell companies. The silence from the television speakers was deafening. Harrison was not a man who needed things explained twice. He knew exactly what those words meant. Are you telling me, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, that one of my regional directors has been running illicit funds through accounts tied to this firm to pay off illegal gambling syndicates? That is exactly what I am telling you, I replied smoothly. He authorized the liquidations from the same internet protocol address he uses to access your confidential client servers. As you are well aware, Harrison, any commingling of executive funds with unlicensed shell companies triggers an automatic Securities and Exchange Commission review. He did not just expose his own assets. He linked a federal money laundering operation directly to your regional branch. David let out a strangled, desperate cry. He threw himself forward, grabbing the edge of the medical tray table. Harrison, please, you have to listen to me, David pleaded, his voice cracking hysterically. It was my personal money. I did not know what she was doing with it. I did not authorize any shell companies. I swear to God, I had no idea. Ignorance is not a defense in the financial sector. David Harrison roared, his fist slamming down onto his mahogany desk with such force the webcam violently shook. You are a regional director. You hold a fiduciary duty to this firm and our clients. You let a known gambler use your corporate identity to wash stolen money. You have exposed this entire company to a massive federal audit because you were too incompetent to monitor your own proxy access. I watched David physically shrink under the crushing weight of Harrison's wrath. For 5 long years, David had treated my career like an annoying inconvenience. At every lavish corporate dinner, at every high society country club gala, he had introduced me to his colleagues with a condescending pat on the back. She does a little bookkeeping for local businesses, he would say with a dismissive chuckle, making sure everyone knew he was the real financial powerhouse in the family. He had never bothered to ask about my promotions. He had never read a single one of the complex corporate fraud case studies I had published. He never cared to learn that Vanguard Forensic was a premier top-tier investigative firm, or that I was its apex predator. His toxic arrogance had completely blinded him to the fact that the woman he was treating like a subordinate was actually a titan in his own industry. He thought I was just a woman with a calculator. He had no idea I was the one the billionaires called when they needed to clean house. And now that arrogant ignorance was the exact weapon tearing his life apart. Natalie Harrison said, taking a deep breath to compose himself, his tone returning to a cold, professional clip. You said you have proof of these transactions. I have the complete digital paper trail fully encrypted on a physical drive right here in my hand, I confirmed. Bank statements, forged invoices, and the exact timestamps of the unauthorized liquidations. The police are already here in my hospital room, and 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Division are on their way right now. David turned to me, his face slick with sweat and tears. Natalie, stop! He begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Please stop! If you give that to the firm, I am ruined. Everything I have worked for will be gone. I am your husband. We are having a baby. You cannot do this to our family. You did this to yourself, David, I replied, my voice devoid of any pity. You threatened to cancel my health insurance while I was fighting for my life in a trauma center. You threatened to steal my child using the resources of a firm you are currently actively destroying. I am simply fulfilling my professional obligation as the newly appointed risk management auditor for Vanguard Forensic. Harrison adjusted his tie, his face completely devoid of mercy. You are absolutely right, Natalie, the CEO said. And I expect a full digital copy of that drive sent directly to our corporate legal team by tomorrow morning. Harrison adjusted his tie again, his expression hardening into a mask of pure corporate ruthlessness. He did not yell this time. He did not need to. The quiet, methodical way he spoke was far more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. David Harrison said, his voice echoing off the sterile hospital walls. Effective immediately, your employment with Vanguard Investment Fund is terminated. You are to surrender your corporate phone, your laptop, and your security clearance badge to the Regional Human Resources Director by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not attempt to log into our servers tonight. Your credentials have already been remotely revoked during this call. David gripped the edge of the medical cart so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, watching the executioner reach for the lever. Harrison, please, he begged, his voice dropping to a hoarse, pathetic whisper. I have given 10 years of my life to this firm. I brought in the Peterson account. I doubled our regional portfolio. You cannot just fire me over a video call. Let me come into the office. Let me explain. There is absolutely nothing left to explain, Harrison replied coldly. You used our financial infrastructure to facilitate a federal crime. You brought catastrophic liability to my doorstep. But the termination of your employment is only the beginning of your problems, David. Harrison reached off camera for a moment and pulled a thick leather-bound folder into view. He flipped it open, scanning the document inside with practiced efficiency. I am looking at your executive compensation contract right now, the CEO continued. Like all senior directors at Vanguard, your contract contains a very specific moral turpitude clause. Engaging in facilitating or failing to report financial fraud constitutes a direct and egregious violation of this agreement. David let out a sharp, suffocating gasp. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing under the harsh fluorescent lights. He knew exactly what that clause meant. Therefore, Harrison said, delivering the fatal blow without a single ounce of hesitation, I am exercising the firm's legal right to invoke the moral turpitude clause. Every single one of your unvested stock options is hereby permanently revoked and returned to the corporate treasury. Your executive pension match is frozen, and you are entirely disqualified from receiving your year-end performance bonuses. The silence in the trauma room was absolute. Even the police officer standing near the door seemed momentarily stunned by the sheer brutal efficiency of the corporate execution. In less than 60 seconds, David had lost everything. The unvested stock options were worth millions of dollars. They were the foundation of his entire identity. They were the reason he felt superior to everyone else, the reason he looked down on my career, and the reason he thought he could effortlessly crush me in a divorce court. And now they were gone, erased by a single sentence over a video call. No. David choked out his legs, finally giving out completely. He collapsed onto his knees on the wet linoleum floor, his expensive wool coat pooling around him in the puddles of melted snow. No, Harrison, you cannot do this. That money is mine. I earned it. I am completely bankrupt without those options. My mother took my retirement savings. You cannot take my equity. I will have nothing left. You should have thought about your equity before you let a desperate gambler use your proxy access to wash her debts. Harrison stated, completely unmoved by the sight of a grown man weeping on the floor. And quite frankly, David, considering the horrific way you have treated your wife tonight, bankrupt is exactly what you deserve. Jamal stood near the foot of my bed, watching the scene unfold with a grim expression of absolute satisfaction. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, making no move to offer any comfort to the man who had nearly killed his sister-in-law. Brenda, still slumped against the glass doors of the trauma bay, let out a low, agonizing moan. She was finally realizing the true scope of her actions. She had not just stolen money. She had single-handedly orchestrated the complete and total destruction of her golden child's life. Harrison looked past David's sobbing form and addressed me directly. Natalie, my legal team will be expecting that encrypted data file in the morning. Please take care of yourself and let me know if you need any additional resources to facilitate the transition of the regional audit. We are incredibly fortunate to have you leading this investigation. I nodded once, keeping my expression entirely professional. Thank you, Harrison. I will have the files securely transmitted by 8 o'clock tomorrow. The video call disconnected with a sharp digital click. The large television screen above my hospital bed went entirely black, plunging the room back into the heavy, tense atmosphere of the emergency department. David remained on the floor, curled into a pathetic, shivering ball. The arrogant, untouchable regional director who had confidently threatened to cancel my health insurance and steal my unborn child just 5 minutes ago no longer existed. He had been completely stripped of his armor. His wealth, his prestigious title, and his formidable corporate backing had all evaporated into thin air. He was just a broken, penniless man crying on a hospital floor, realizing too late that the woman he had severely underestimated was the one holding the match that burned his empire to the ground. The heavy silence that followed the disconnected video call was suffocating. The only sound in the trauma room was the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor and David's ragged, pathetic sobbing on the wet floor. The original police officer standing near the doorway adjusted his duty belt, waiting for the financial detectives to arrive. But before anyone could say another word, the heavy glass sliding doors of the trauma bay hissed open again. Jamal stepped slightly to the side as 2 more Aspen police officers entered the room. Unlike the first officer who had been patrolling the hospital, these 2 had clearly just come in from the freezing storm. Their heavy, tactical winter jackets were dusted with fresh snow, and their boots left thick, muddy tracks on the linoleum. They did not look like financial crimes detectives. They looked like patrol officers who had just come from a physical crime scene. The taller of the 2 officers walked directly past David, completely ignoring the weeping former executive on the floor. He stopped right in front of Brenda, who was still slumped against the wall. In his thick gloved hand, he held up a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the sterile plastic was a distinct, elegant pocket knife. It had a polished pearl handle and a sleek 3-inch stainless steel blade. I recognized it immediately. It was a custom-engraved knife Brenda always carried in her designer purse, claiming she needed it for opening packages and cutting loose threads from her expensive clothes. Brenda stared at the plastic bag, her eyes widening in absolute horror. The remaining color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She pressed her hands flat against the cold tiles, trying to push herself further back into the wall, as if she could somehow disappear into it. "Ma'am, The tall officer said, his voice deep and authoritative, carrying no trace of sympathy. "We are not the Financial Crimes Unit. We were dispatched to the Pine Ridge Road cabin to secure the scene after the snowplow drivers reported finding a freezing woman in the driveway." David stopped crying. He slowly raised his head from his hands, his swollen red eyes locking onto the plastic evidence bag. "What is that?" he croaked, his voice raw and shaking. "Why do you have my mother's knife?" The officer did not look at David. He kept his stern gaze locked entirely on Brenda. "When we arrived at the cabin to investigate the circumstances of the severe hypothermia, we found the victim's vehicle parked in the driveway." The officer explained, his voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. All 4 tires had been violently slashed. The cuts were deep, jagged, and deliberate. They were not damaged by the weather or road debris. They were destroyed with a blade. Brenda let out a high-pitched, frantic gasp. "I did not do that," she cried, her voice cracking in pure desperation. "I dropped that knife in the snow hours ago. Anyone could have picked it up. There is a blizzard outside. You cannot prove anything." The officer lowered the evidence bag slightly, his expression hardening. "We do not need to rely on the knife alone, Brenda." He took a step closer, towering over her trembling form. "There is an all-night gas station situated directly across the main road from your cabin property. They upgraded their exterior security cameras 2 months ago. We pulled the digital footage from their main server before we drove down to this hospital." Brenda completely stopped breathing. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came out. The high-definition infrared cameras cut right through the falling snow. The officer continued, systematically destroying her pathetic lies. "We watched the video, Brenda. We watched you walk out onto the driveway 20 minutes before your son threw his wife out the front door. We watched you walk around the dark SUV. We watched you bend down and deliberately puncture all 4 tires with that exact pearl-handled knife." David let out a sick, strangled noise. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, moving away from his mother as if she were suddenly infected with a deadly disease. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated horror. "You slashed the tires. You knew she would have no way to turn on the heater. You knew she would freeze." "She did not just slash the tires, sir." The second officer spoke up, his voice ringing with disgust. "The security footage also showed her tampering with the external utility box on the side of the cabin. She manually shut off the emergency backup generator and disconnected the exterior heating vent that leads to the front porch. She made absolutely sure that there would be no source of heat anywhere near the front door." The sheer level of premeditation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. David stared at the woman who had raised him, finally seeing the absolute monster hiding beneath the pristine white cashmere and expensive perfume. She had not just acted in a moment of panicked rage over missing money. She had calculated every single move. She had actively prepared the execution ground before she ever told her son to lock the door. Brenda shook her head frantically, tears ruining her perfectly applied makeup. "No, no, you are taking it out of context," she sobbed, reaching a shaking hand out toward David. "David, tell them. Tell them I was just trying to protect our family. I was just making sure she could not steal your car. I did not want her to die. I swear it." But the officers were completely finished listening to her lies. The tall officer handed the plastic evidence bag to his partner and reached behind his duty belt. The harsh metallic sound of steel handcuffs being unclipped echoed sharply through the emergency room. The metallic sound hung in the air like a death sentence. Brenda stared at the steel handcuffs in the officer's hands as if they were venomous snakes. She pressed her back so hard against the glass doors that I thought they might shatter under her weight. She shook her head wildly, her eyes darting around the room, desperately looking for an escape route that simply did not exist. "You cannot arrest me for vandalism," Brenda squeaked out, her voice high-pitched and frantic as she grasped at invisible straws. "I will pay for the tires. I will buy her a whole new car tomorrow morning. It is just property damage. I am a respected member of this community. I am the president of my homeowners association. You do not put handcuffs on people like me over 4 flat tires." The tall officer stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He grabbed Brenda by the arm, his grip firm and completely uncompromising, and pulled her away from the sliding doors. "This is not about property damage, ma'am," the officer said, his voice hard and entirely devoid of pity. "When you disable a vehicle and intentionally cut off a heating source in a remote mountainous area during a state of emergency blizzard, the legal classification completely changes." He spun her around, forcing her arms behind her back. Brenda gasped loudly, struggling weakly against his professional hold, but she was no match for the seasoned police officer. The ambient temperature outside that cabin was -10 degrees Fahrenheit. The officer continued, his voice ringing clearly for everyone in the trauma room to hear. "The human body cannot survive in those conditions without proper shelter. The security footage clearly shows you premeditating the removal of her only heat source. You knew exactly what you were doing when you disconnected that exterior heating vent. You were not just trying to inconvenience her or trap her so she could not drive away. You were creating a lethal environment. You used the weather as a deadly weapon." The second officer stepped closer, holding the evidence bag containing the pearl-handled pocketknife securely at his side. "We consulted with the district attorney on our way to the hospital." The second officer added, his tone strictly business. "Given the severe hypothermia, the victim suffered the medical evidence of her core temperature dropping to critical levels and the calculated premeditation caught on tape, the prosecutor authorized immediate felony charges." Brenda started to hyperventilate. The word felony seemed to finally punch through her thick wall of denial. "Felony." She choked out, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her sweat-slicked face. "No, I have a clean record. You cannot do this to me. David, call a lawyer. Call the best defense attorney in Denver right now. Tell them your mother is being harassed." David did not move a single inch. He remained on his knees on the wet linoleum floor, staring at his mother with absolute, paralyzing disgust. The woman he had worshipped, the woman who had dictated every major decision in his life and convinced him to throw his pregnant wife out into the snow, was finally being exposed as a cold-blooded monster. He was not going to help her. He could not even help himself anymore. His career was gone, his money was stolen, and his marriage was entirely destroyed. He just stared at her, completely silent, letting her sink entirely on her own. "Brenda," the tall officer said, completely ignoring her frantic, hyperventilating pleas. "You are officially under arrest for attempted murder in the second degree, as well as reckless endangerment and felony evidence tampering." The heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed sharply through the trauma bay. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The cold steel clamped down tight over the sleeves of her expensive white cashmere cardigan, permanently binding her hands together behind her back. The physical restraint was the ultimate symbol of her complete downfall. The woman who had tried to control everything and everyone around her was now entirely powerless. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer began reciting her Miranda rights, his voice a steady rhythmic drumbeat of justice. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" As the officer read her rights, Brenda completely broke down. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch who had spent years making me feel completely worthless was now sobbing uncontrollably, her face red and contorted in pure terror. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that she could not even stand on her own 2 feet. Her knees buckled under the crushing weight of reality. The second officer had to step in quickly and grab her other arm just to keep her from collapsing completely onto the puddles of melted snow covering the floor. I sat up slightly in my hospital bed, adjusting the oxygen tube resting around my neck, and watched the scene unfold with absolute clarity. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her. She had manipulated my husband, stolen his life savings, and literally left me to freeze to death in a blizzard just to cover up her own pathetic underground gambling addiction. She had gambled with my life, and she had completely lost. The two officers grabbed Brenda by her upper arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. Her legs were completely useless, trembling so violently that the officers had to physically bear most of her weight just to keep her standing. The pristine white cashmere cardigan she had worn like a royal mantle was now soaked with dirty puddle water and stained with her own smeared makeup. Her perfectly sprayed hair stuck to her sweaty forehead in erratic, jagged clumps. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant high society matriarch who had marched into my trauma room demanding I sign away my life. She just looked like a pathetic, broken criminal. "Let me go!" Brenda shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the sterile tiles. "You cannot walk me through the hospital like this. People know me. I am on the board of the country club. I am the president of the homeowners association. Someone is going to see me. Give me my coat. Cover my hands." The officers completely ignored her frantic demands for dignity. They turned her toward the heavy sliding glass doors of the trauma bay. As they marched her forward, Brenda twisted her head back, looking desperately over her shoulder at the man she had manipulated for his entire life. "David, do something," she screamed, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. "Call my lawyer. Call the mayor. Tell them I am sick. Do not just sit there and let them take your mother away in handcuffs." David remained on his knees on the wet linoleum floor. He did not reach for his phone. He did not stand up. He simply stared at her with hollow, dead eyes, watching the monster who had destroyed his entire existence finally face the consequences of her own actions. He had no money left to hire her a lawyer. He had no corporate clout left to call in a favor. He was completely empty. The glass doors hissed open, and the officers marched Brenda out into the main corridor of the emergency department. The chaotic noise of the winter storm triage suddenly died down. Doctors, nurses, orderlies, and patients sitting in the crowded waiting area all stopped what they were doing to watch. They watched the wealthy, arrogant woman, who had practically kicked the front doors down earlier, now being frog-marched down the brightly lit hallway by two armed police officers. Brenda tried to hide her face behind her shoulder, sobbing hysterically, as the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated her ultimate public humiliation. The heavy double doors of the ambulance bay eventually swallowed her screams, leaving a profound, cleansing silence in their wake. In the trauma room, David let his head drop, his chin resting heavily on his chest. He took a ragged, shaky breath and slowly turned his swollen eyes toward the large man standing near the foot of my bed. "Jamal," David whispered, his voice trembling with the desperate need for a familiar lifeline. "Jamal, what are we going to do? My career is gone. My mother is going to prison. What do we do now?" Jamal looked down at David. The expression on the doctor's face was not one of familial sympathy or shared grief. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at David the way one might look at a venomous snake that had just been crushed under a boot. "There is no we." "David," Jamal said, his deep voice vibrating with absolute terrifying finality, "do not you ever refer to me as your family again." David flinched as if he had been physically struck. "But you are married to Simone," he pleaded weakly. "We are brothers." "Not anymore," Jamal stated, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "Your mother did not act alone tonight, David. She could not have washed that stolen money without a proxy. Your sister actively chose to participate in a federal money laundering scheme. Simone took the money I earned working 80-hour night shifts in this emergency room, the money I bled for to secure our children's future, and she handed it over to cover your mother's underground poker debts." David stared at the floor, completely unable to defend his sister. The toxic rot of his family ran too deep to ever be salvaged. "My shift ends in 2 hours." Jamal continued, his voice cold and clinical. "I am walking straight out of this hospital and driving to my lawyer's office. I am filing for an emergency order of sole physical and legal custody of my children the second the courthouse opens. I am serving your sister with divorce papers, and I am handing over every single piece of financial evidence Natalie gave me directly to the federal authorities." Jamal took a step closer to the weeping man on the floor, delivering the final crushing blow. "You all thought you were so incredibly smart. You thought you could lie, steal, and manipulate your way through life because you had money and status. But your toxic family tree is completely dead, David. I am chopping it down right now, and I am making absolutely sure my children never spend another second in the poisonous shadow of your bloodline. David squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a low, agonizing moan as the last remaining pillar of his life completely collapsed. He had no wife, no mother, no career, and now his extended family was entirely severing ties with him. He was completely, utterly alone. Jamal turned his back on David, completely dismissing his existence. He walked over to my hospital bed, his expression softening instantly as he checked the digital readings on my cardiac monitor. He reached out and gently adjusted the warm, forced air blanket covering my shivering shoulders. "You rest now, Natalie," Jamal said softly, offering me a small, genuine smile of profound respect. "The police will handle Brenda. The corporate lawyers will handle David. You just focus on yourself and that baby. You won this war." Jamal gave me a final respectful nod and stepped out through the sliding glass doors, leaving me completely alone with the wreckage of my marriage. The heavy doors hissed shut, sealing the trauma room and cutting off the chaotic noise of the emergency department. The sudden quiet was heavy, punctuated only by the steady rhythm of my heart monitor and the wet, ragged sound of David gasping for air on the floor. I looked down at the man kneeling beside my hospital bed. The contrast between the man before me now and the man who had stood on the front porch of our Aspen cabin just a few hours ago was absolutely staggering. Earlier tonight, David had looked like an untouchable giant. He had towered over me in the freezing wind, his face twisted in a mask of arrogant superiority. He had weaponized his corporate title, his expensive cabin, and his mother's lies to make me feel like a worthless parasite. He had literally held my life in his hands and casually thrown it away, locking that heavy oak door without a single ounce of hesitation. Now he was nothing. His tailored wool overcoat, a garment that cost more than most people made in a month, was completely ruined, soaked in dirty puddle water and hospital floor grime. His perfect posture had collapsed. His face was bloated red and slick with tears and sweat. He was entirely stripped of the arrogant armor he had worn for the last 5 years. David slowly raised his head. When he looked at me, there was no anger left in his eyes, only a hollow, frantic desperation. He placed his hands flat on the wet linoleum and literally began to crawl toward me. He dragged his knees across the dirty floor, inching closer to the side of my bed, like a beaten animal. "Natalie." He choked out his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He reached his shaking hands up and wrapped his fingers tightly around the cold metal guardrail of the hospital bed. "Please, please, you have to help me. I have absolutely nothing left." He rested his forehead against the metal railing, sobbing so violently that the entire hospital bed vibrated. "Harrison took everything." David wept, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic rush. "My stock options are gone. My accounts are frozen. Jamal took the family. My mother is going to federal prison. I am completely bankrupt, Natalie. You are the only thing I have left in the entire world." I stared down at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust. He was not apologizing because he suddenly realized the value of our marriage. He was not crying because he almost killed me. He was crying because his safety net had been completely destroyed, and he was desperately looking for a new host to latch onto. He had just spent 5 years treating my career like a joke, and now that his empire was ashes, he suddenly realized I was the only person in the room with a stable, highly lucrative income. "Please let me be a father to our baby," David begged, raising his tear-streaked face to look at me. "I will change. I swear to God I will change. I will go to therapy. I will do whatever you want me to do. We can move away from Aspen. We can start over completely fresh. Just the 3 of us. No Brenda. No toxic family. Just a clean slate. I want to be a father, Natalie. Do not take my child away from me." He reached his trembling hand through the metal guardrail, desperately trying to touch my arm. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "You are my wife. I love you. Forgive me. I was blind, but I see the truth now. I looked at his outstretched hand. I remembered how I had begged him standing barefoot in the snow, screaming his name as the freezing wind tore through my clothes. I remembered how he had shoved me backward and slammed the door in my face. The sheer audacity of his request was staggering. He genuinely believed that a few tears and a pathetic apology could erase the fact that he had tried to let the winter storm execute me. I slowly pulled my arm back, making sure his fingers did not even graze my hospital gown. The freezing cold that had almost killed me in the driveway had permanently settled into my heart, and I had absolutely no warmth left to offer him. I looked down at him, my face a mask of absolute calm. I did not scream. I did not cry. The panic and the heartbreak had completely burned themselves out, leaving behind a pristine, razor-sharp clarity. I reached over to my left arm. With a steady hand, I peeled back the clear surgical tape holding the intravenous line in place. Before Jamal had walked out of the room, he had quietly noted that my core temperature was fully stabilized and my vitals were completely normal. I did not need the heated fluids anymore. I pulled the small needle from my vein, pressing a piece of sterile gauze against the tiny drop of blood. David watched me, his swollen eyes wide with confusion, as I swung my legs over the side of the hospital mattress. I planted my bare feet firmly on the cold linoleum floor. A few hours ago, the freezing temperature of the cabin porch had brought me to my knees and nearly stopped my heart. Now the chill of the hospital tiles felt incredibly grounding. It reminded me that I was alive, that I had survived the absolute worst they could throw at me, and that I was never going to let anyone make me feel small or powerless ever again. I stood up to my full height, looking down at the man who was still kneeling in the dirty puddle of melted snow. "You want to be a father?" I asked, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet room. "You think a child needs a man who cannot even stand up to his own mother? You think I would ever let my baby be raised by someone so blindingly arrogant and fundamentally weak that he would execute his pregnant wife over a fake bank statement? You are not a father, David. You are just a scared little boy who lost his allowance." David flinched as if I had struck him directly across the face. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg some more, but no words came out. His jaw trembled silently. I stepped away from the bed and walked over to the rolling tray table. The thick manila folder Brenda had brought in earlier was still sitting there, slightly damp at the edges, where it had touched a puddle, but entirely intact. Next to it was the cheap black plastic pen she had aggressively tossed down when she demanded I sign away my entire life for a miserable $50,000 severance check. I picked up the folder and the pen. I walked back over to David. He looked up at me, his face slick with sweat and tears, a pathetic glimmer of false hope flashing in his red eyes. He genuinely thought I was picking up the papers to throw them in the trash. He thought this was the part where I told him we could rip them up and start over. Instead, I dropped the thick stack of legal documents directly onto the wet floor right in front of his knees. I tossed the black pen on top of them. "Your mother drafted an incredibly thorough divorce settlement." I noted, my tone completely conversational, as if we were discussing a standard corporate merger. She made sure it included a strict waiver of alimony, a complete separation of assets, and a full relinquishment of any claim to the family trust. She designed it to leave me with absolutely nothing. But she accidentally did me a massive favor, because under the terms of this highly specific contract, you also waive any right to contest my personal assets, including my accounting firm. "Natalie, no," David sobbed, staring at the papers as if they were covered in lethal poison. "Please do not make me do this. I will not sign them. I will fight for you. I will prove I can be a good husband. You have absolutely no resources left to fight me," I reminded him, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "Your firm fired you. Your accounts are frozen by a federal investigation. You do not even have premium health insurance anymore. I am the apex predator now, David. So you are going to pick up that pen and you are going to sign your name on every single dotted line your mother prepared." I looked down at him one last time, making sure my final words would be permanently burned into his memory. "Sign it," I commanded. "This child will never know the coward you are." I did not wait to watch him pick up the pen. I turned my back on the man I had spent 5 years trying to fix. I walked straight toward the heavy glass sliding doors. They hissed open automatically, welcoming me back into the brightly lit main corridor of the hospital. I stepped out into the hallway, leaving David completely alone in Trauma Room 1. As the glass doors slid shut behind me, the last sound I heard was the echoing broken wail of a man who had finally realized he had destroyed his own life. 6 months had passed since the longest night of my life. The bitter, freezing winds of the Colorado blizzard were nothing but a distant memory, now entirely replaced by the bright, warm spring sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. I stood at the head of a massive mahogany conference table in downtown Chicago, looking out over the breathtaking view of Lake Michigan. I was 34 years old, 8 months pregnant, and I had never felt more alive. My tailored navy blue maternity suit fit perfectly, radiating a quiet, undeniable authority that I had finally learned to fully embrace. I closed the thick leather portfolio resting on the table, wrapping up the quarterly risk management briefing for Vanguard Forensic. The 12 senior partners sitting around the room nodded in unison, their expressions filled with genuine respect. There were no condescending pats on the back in this room. There was no arrogant husband sitting beside me, rolling his eyes and telling his colleagues that I just did a little bookkeeping for local businesses. I was the head of the compliance division, the apex predator of the financial auditing world, and I had just guided the firm through its most profitable quarter in over a decade. "Thank you all for your diligent work this week," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the large boardroom. "We caught the discrepancies in the offshore accounts before they became a liability. That is exactly why Harrison trusts us with his portfolio. Let us keep the momentum going." As the partners packed up their briefcases and filed out of the conference room, my lead corporate investigator lingered behind. His name was Ian, a sharp, meticulous former federal agent who had become my most trusted colleague over the past few months. He walked over to the head of the table and handed me a single crisp manila envelope. "The final court documents from Colorado just came through the wire this morning." Ian said, his tone casual, but carrying a distinct hint of satisfaction. "I thought you might want to see the official signatures before we close the file completely." I took the envelope and slowly slid the heavy stack of legal papers out. I did not feel a sudden spike of anxiety. I did not feel any lingering fear. I just felt a profound, deeply satisfying sense of closure. Brenda officially accepted the plea deal at her hearing today. Ian continued, leaning comfortably against the edge of the mahogany table. The federal prosecutors did not budge an inch on the sentencing guidelines. She pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud, money laundering, and attempted murder in the second degree. She is serving a mandatory 10 years in a high-security federal penitentiary. There is absolutely no possibility of early parole. She tried to leverage her country club connections to get house arrest, but the judge laughed her right out of the courtroom. I looked down at the documents, imagining the arrogant high society matriarch who had demanded I sign away my life, now wearing a standard-issue prison uniform. "And David?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I know the divorce went through without a single contested asset, but I have not checked the financial monitors in weeks." Ian chuckled softly, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "It went through perfectly, because he had absolutely no money left to fight you," Ian replied. "David tried to hire a defense attorney for about a week, but he ran out of cash almost instantly. When Harrison formally revoked his unvested stock options and froze his executive pension, David was left completely destitute. The corporate lawyers permanently blacklisted him from the entire financial sector. Nobody on Wall Street will even look at his resume now. I ran a routine background check on him yesterday, just to finalize our internal compliance audit," Ian noted, crossing his arms. "He lost the Aspen cabin to the bank. He is currently working as a junior retail associate at a discount electronics store in a strip mall outside of Denver." He is making minimum wage, wearing a cheap polyester uniform, and trying to pay off the massive legal debts his mother left behind when she drained his remaining accounts. He has absolutely nothing. I slid the legal documents back into the manila envelope and handed it back to Ian. "File it away," I said, my voice light and completely unburdened. "That chapter of my life is officially closed." Ian gave me a respectful nod and walked out of the boardroom, leaving me alone in the sunlit office. I rested my hand gently on my large, round belly, feeling a strong, reassuring kick from the baby growing inside me. The child was healthy, incredibly strong, and entirely safe from the toxic poison of that family tree. Everything I had lost in the blizzard had merely made room for everything I had gained. I stepped closer to the massive glass window, pressing my hand lightly against the warm pane. Below me, the city of Chicago was alive with the vibrant, bustling energy of spring. The deep blue waters of Lake Michigan glittered brightly under the midday sun, a stark, beautiful contrast to the blinding, suffocating whiteout of that Colorado winter night. I closed my eyes for a long moment, letting the soothing warmth of the sunlight soak deeply into my skin. It was still incredibly hard to believe that just 6 months ago, I was lying barefoot in a snowbank, my heart slowing down to a dangerous crawl, entirely convinced that my life was over. But looking back on it now from the safety and triumph of my own empire, I realized that the blizzard was not a tragedy. It was without a single doubt the absolute best thing that could have ever happened to me. For 5 long years, I had been living in a house that was slowly being consumed by an invisible rot. I had twisted myself into painful knots, trying to be the perfect, accommodating wife to a man who possessed no spine, and the perfect, respectful daughter-in-law to a woman who possessed no soul. I had deliberately dimmed my own light, hidden my own massive professional success, and quietly absorbed their constant toxic insults just to keep the fragile peace. The rot was spreading rapidly, threatening to consume the innocent child I was trying so desperately to bring into the world. The blizzard changed all of that in a matter of hours. The lethal plunging temperature of that storm did exactly what the freezing cold is meant to do. It froze the rot dead in its tracks. It crystallized the lies, the manipulation, and the breathtaking cruelty of the people I had foolishly called my family. It made their poisonous dynamic so rigid and fragile that all it took was one calculated, decisive strike of truth to shatter it completely. When David locked that heavy oak door and left me to freeze, he thought he was finally silencing me. He had no idea he was actually setting me free. He chipped away the heavy chains of marital obligation and societal expectation, leaving me with nothing but my own unbreakable foundation to stand on. I looked down at my baby bump, resting both of my hands protectively over my child. This baby will never know the coldness of a father who prioritizes his corporate image over his own flesh and blood. This baby will never be subjected to the cruel, calculating games of a grandmother who views people as nothing more than financial assets to be drained and discarded. Instead, my child will grow up watching a mother who knows her own worth, a mother who demands absolute respect, and a mother who refuses to compromise her boundaries for anyone. To everyone watching this right now, I want you to take a hard, honest look at the people you are twisting yourself into knots to please. We are so often conditioned by society to believe that family is an absolute unbreakable bond, even when that bond is actively suffocating us. We are constantly told to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, and to endlessly forgive those who repeatedly demonstrate that they do not have our best interests at heart. But I am here to tell you that true family does not operate on condition or convenience. True family does not force you to hide your brilliance to protect their fragile egos. And most importantly, true family protects you from the storm. They do not lock you out in it. If someone is continuously making you feel small, if they are making you pay the heavy price for their own insecurities, or if they demand your unconditional loyalty while offering you nothing but betrayal in return, you have every right to walk away. Setting a strict boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of profound self-preservation. You do not owe your warmth to people who would gladly watch you freeze. You have the absolute power to stop being the tragic victim in their narrative and become the apex predator of your own life. Do not wait for a literal or metaphorical blizzard to show you who they really are. Trust your instincts, recognize your own value, and build an impenetrable fortress around your own peace. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and cut off toxic family members to save yourself? How did you find the strength to set those life-saving boundaries when everyone else told you to just let it go? I want to read your stories, so please share your personal experiences in the comments below. Let us build a community that celebrates walking away from the cold. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories of resilience, justice, and absolute empowerment. Share this video with anyone who might need a powerful reminder that they are strong enough to weather any storm and brave enough to leave the people who created it. Thank you so much for watching my story, and always remember the most beautiful spring only arrives after you survive the harshest winter. The harrowing journey of Natalie teaches us a profound and often painful lesson about human relationships. The title of family does not grant someone a free pass to disrespect, manipulate, or endanger you. For years, Natalie dimmed her own brilliance and endured subtle indignities to appease a husband and mother-in-law who fundamentally undervalued her. Her story vividly illustrates that true empowerment begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. David and Brenda operated under the assumption that Natalie would simply absorb their cruelty because she had always been the quiet peacemaker. However, when the blizzard forced her into a life-or-death situation, the cold truth crystallized. Toxic people will gladly sacrifice your well-being to protect their own fragile egos and hidden secrets. Natalie's ultimate triumph was not merely about exposing financial fraud and seeing her abusers face justice. It was about reclaiming her identity and realizing that her independence was her greatest weapon. We often hold on to destructive relationships because society conditions us to prioritize family harmony over our own mental and physical safety. Natalie's firm refusal to accept David's pathetic, desperate apologies teaches us that offering forgiveness to someone who has shown zero regard for your life is nothing more than self-sabotage. Setting a strict, uncompromising boundary is never an act of malice, but a necessary act of self-preservation. When you finally stop accepting less than you deserve, you clear the toxic debris from your life and make room for genuine respect, success, and peace. The freezing storm she survived was terrifying, but it successfully stripped away the dangerous illusion of love, leaving behind an unbreakable woman. If you are currently compromising your peace and shrinking yourself to keep toxic people comfortable, I urge you to draw your line in the sand today and walk toward your own freedom.